If there was ever a time for a needed reset of our national thinking, a time for a refocusing of our pulpits, a reacquaintance with truth and history, and fundamental reembracing of a biblical worldview, it's today. Hello and welcome to Stand in the Gap. I'm Sam Rohr, and I'm going to be joined in this program again by Pastor Isaac Crockett as we begin a new series of programs that we're calling 10 Principles to National Renewal. Today's program will be part one of a two-part program focusing on the first essential principle and that is integrity. Now, as you look around our nation and this world, do you not wonder what in the world is happening? Do you wonder how law and justice can be so quickly distorted or how truth can be so quickly trampled? Do you wonder how those things considered a generation ago as evil and immoral can now be promoted from the highest positions of civil and church leadership? Do you wonder if there's a reason for this and a remedy to it? Well, if you answered yes to one or all of most questions, you're not alone. But are we without direction? Are we without a roadmap for renewal? The answer is no. There is hope. And there is a way, but not without God's help and following His plan. Now, over the next weeks, it's our intent to share God's plan for a blessed nation and the foundational principles identified in Scriptures and officially adopted by our nation's founders. These are God's principles, non-negotiable and unable to be improved upon. They're essential for freedom and God's blessing on our nation or, frankly, any nation. We are renewed by them to our blessing, or we continue to reject them to our demise. Now, the first bedrock principle is, as I mentioned, integrity. Integrity itself sits on three foundations, which we'll identify in this program and in part two next week. Most American citizens today have no idea of how our counterparts in the days of the American Revolution believed, thought, and acted. In the early 18th century, most citizens understood the nature of God and honored His expectations for nations, fully embracing them. We, in the 21st century, still enjoy many of the fruits and the rewards of their faithfulness, diligence, hard work, and fervent prayers. But these benefits are quickly slipping. In part two, it's because we don't understand how they came about. And in part because we don't know where they came from, or most importantly, know or fear the one from whom they came. For generations, we in America have ignored God's principles. We've not taught them to our children, and by our disobedience, encouraged government to actually become their God. Silent pulpits have contributed by refusing to teach the whole counsel of God. But if, like Gideon's 300 a long time ago, a dedicated core of spiritual warriors from the community, and we did it now, community to community, from pulpit to pulpit, and from position of elected office to another, if we were all to stand in the gap, identifying, understanding, embracing, and obediently building integrity back into the pillars of society, we can begin and grow once again. And what a magnificent change would occur. And with that introduction, let me welcome and talk right now to Isaac. Isaac, it's great to be with you today. No guest. We are the guest. You are the guest. We are the guest. But we're talking about something of great importance, and we're going down this road because people across America, good people, know something's up. Mm-hmm. But most are saying, is there any hope? Is there any direction? We say, yeah, there is a direction. We're going to take and lay down something that hopefully will be important. Integrity is where we're going to go today as the first principle. And like we do often, we want to define it. So if you could, define integrity and maybe illustrate it a little bit if you don't mind.
Well, Sam, you've talked about this recently on our radio program as well, and you went to a passage in the Old Testament, Psalm 25, and the word integrity comes up, at least in the King James Version and similar versions in the Old Testament a lot of times. And so in that, you have David is pleading with the Lord in Psalm 25, almost like God is his judge and he's standing before him. And the Old Testament words that we translate as integrity and upright or uprightness, they give this idea of complete innocence. So he's trying to say, I'm innocent. He said, unto thee, O Lord, do I lift up my soul. O my God, I trust in thee. Let me not be ashamed. And he goes on, he says, don't let my enemies triumph over me. Don't let anyone trusting in you be trampled over. And he says, teach me your ways, show me your ways, lead me in your paths, lead me in an upright way. And then at the end, almost the very end of this song that he's written, this poetry, he says, let integrity and uprightness preserve me. I wait on these. So he says, this is my preserving, this is what's going to save me. And that's in the Old Testament. And then in the New Testament, you see almost every writer in the New Testament uses this word of conscience. I want to have a conscience, that avoids offense to God and man. So it is a very biblical concept, this idea, but we have to understand what the basis is for it. So maybe you want to talk, and I think that's what we're getting into on this program, is what is that basis for integrity?
Well, I think, Isaac, just as we go into it a little bit, a verse that you referenced you didn't reference it, we referred to the New Testament. Integrity is from the Latin word integer. It means whole or complete, and that's what you're describing. David says vertical relationship to God, and uprightness and integrity, and then uprightness, which really means, it's actually used in the book of Job, referring to Job. He was a straight shooter. It's a character term, and it was direct. But you know what? I think Philippians 4:8, the Apostle Paul talks to the Philippian church, and he puts it this way. He says, finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, honest, just, pure, lovely, whatsoever things are of good report. He lays out the way we should think. And I think if we just leave our listeners with this, our viewers right now with this thought, when you, ladies and gentlemen, have integrity, a person of integrity, you are a person of character, but you are complete when that vertical relationship with God is right, your heart, as David said, and that starts with how we think and how we think in our heart, but then it's how we act. So the way we act comes from the way we think, starts with God vertically, extends horizontally, and that, in effect, is the matter of integrity. But you can't start a nation, or you can't have a family, or in any regard, without having that foundation. And so that's where we're going to start first in this program. We'll be back in just a moment.
Truth, flexible or permanent? The Bible, ancient history, or powerfully relevant? Culture, a reflection of enlightenment, or warning signs? The pastor, commentator, or frontline combatant? Every day, American Pastors Network speaks to these questions where and when they matter. With hundreds of affiliate radio stations nationwide, a website and mobile app screening today's headlines through the twin lenses of the Bible and the Constitution, educating, informing, equipping. This is the American Pastors Network. The time is now to stand in the gap for truth.
Welcome back to Stand in the Gap, and Sam and I are talking today about the first of 10 foundational principles to have a blessed nation. And, very, very beginning of the book of Psalms, it talks about a blessed man and what he does do and what he doesn't do, who he hangs around, and his delight is in the law of the Lord. And Sam, throughout the book of Psalms, it's a hymnal, it's poetry, but it's very personal things, very devotional. And that's what I think why so many people are drawn of all the Old Testament books. I think more of us have pages in Psalms worn out from our thumbs turning there because they mean so much to us in a personal way. And so we were talking about integrity as this first step in having a blessed nation, having a blessed family, church, whatever. There has to be integrity. And you said that integrity, it's not just an understanding. It comes from God. There's this God to man aspect of it, vertical aspect, but you said it has to be then lived out, just like Jesus showed us how to live. And you said that it has to be the foundation of what we do. So that brings us to a passage in the Psalms, Psalm 121, right from the very beginning. It talks about, looking to the Lord for what we need. But David actually says, except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman gets up to look out in vain, because if you're not trusting in the Lord, that's foundational. Why when we look at our history, the foundation, the founding of America, our founding fathers we sometimes talk about, why did they think this was necessary, and to what extent, what impact did this have on our early national founders?
Well, Isaac, it's we could spend a long time on that. The history is just so amazing when you begin to talk about those who came before and laid down the foundations of America before it was America. And when I think that, I think back of a couple of entities. There were where we are in this nation did not occur overnight. It was the process of many people in their time laying down a common foundation. We're talking about foundational principles, but they understood these things. And again, we talk about from a biblical worldview, everything we're talking about. And our founders understood, and I'll explain just a few of them right now, fully understood it as a biblical view of the world. So when we talk about a biblical worldview today, we're talking about not something new, but it's the way God always wanted people to live. And I think of the Pilgrims, Isaac, as one example. The Pilgrims landed in 1620. A lot of people don't know that, but the Pilgrims came from Holland, excuse me, and they came here for two reasons. One, they came as missionaries, and two, they came because they were losing their children to they said a decadent culture in Holland. Can you imagine when you look at today and you say a decadent culture in Holland in 1600s? The answer was yes. And the fathers said, we better do something while we still have the strength to do it. That was their motivation to come. And when they came, as an indication, the Mayflower Compact, our first document of law, laid out their idea. It's that they started out by saying, "In the name of God, Amen." And then they said, "Having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith." Then that's it. That was the Pilgrims. And when they came, the first thing they did, they went down on their knees and they thanked God, and their whole history was all about them in a right relationship to God, even thinking that when it didn't rain and their crops were bad, that it was because of their relationship to God had gotten off base, and they got down and they repented. Everything was driven by the relationship to God and then how they acted. Well, the Puritans came along about 10 years later, and Governor John Winthrop then he started the colony then. But he called out in prayer to God at that point, Isaac, and he said that he envisioned this new nation just starting, it wasn't even a nation at that point, as being a shining city on a hill, from which this light would go around the world. This light of what? The light of the gospel that the Pilgrims had brought as missionaries to the Indians and raising their children in the fear of God. He came along as a governor and said, all right, shining city on the hill. Ronald Reagan picked up that comment, we know, and made that even more popular. But then I go to William Penn. William Penn of 1692, right here in Pennsylvania, where we're sitting, laid down his frame of government, he called it in 1692, and he laid out the principles. Actually, Isaac, the principles we're going to be elucidating here in these programs actually were written down by William Penn, right from Scripture. But William Penn said, you know what, I could be a king in Pennsylvania. I don't want to be. I want to set up something here that the world would want. And he began what he said was a holy experiment that the whole world wanted to see. And he said, if we lay down the principles of godly government and who and how we are before God and who He is, then we will be able to perhaps enjoy a new nation under God. So, and then those who came after him built upon him, Isaac. But you know what? They knew. The point is, they knew who God was. They purposely entertained and cultivated a relationship with God vertically. They acted it out horizontally. So they started with the right place, foundation. But I want to come back and ask you this, because there are other passages in Scripture, and they were copying Israel in the Old, is what they were doing. And they made it very clear about that. But they knew that there was a difference, as we should today, that there's a difference in knowing about God and actually choosing to follow God, isn't there? Is there a verse there, a passage that comes to mind?
And you always refer, I shouldn't say always, but you often go to Joshua, in the book of Joshua, in different parts, but especially at the end there in Joshua 24, where Joshua says, look, we've tried to do things the way that Moses taught us, but as for me and my house, what I have immediate control over, so to speak, we will serve the Lord. And you see that the others seem to follow him. It was after the dying off of that generation then that things deteriorated. And so this is important, this idea of self-government. And this is one of the things I forget. So many times I look at, when I talk about government, I'm thinking of our civil leaders, civil leadership, church government maybe. But sometimes we forget about family government or self-government. A lot of times in the Bible, especially in the New Testament, it falls under the word self-control. And if we are controlling ourselves, it makes it a whole lot easier. If you when I used to teach in public schools and things, if I have a room of well-behaved children, then I don't have to try to control the classroom. We can talk about what they want. But if every one of the kids wants to go and do their own thing instead of obeying the rules, it's very difficult. And so we need to have that decision. I will serve the Lord. And the Pilgrims, that was something they did in Holland. They had liberty. As nonconformists, they loved England, but they didn't have liberty. So they go to Holland, and it was too much liberty. And they were afraid. So they were teaching their children, but then their children would go around to other kids and learn all these wicked ways of the world. It was interesting being in former communist countries, preaching in Eastern Europe. They would say similar things. They say, we would rather have communism and persecution. Nothing on the grocery shelves, but people packing the churches. Now there's all this stuff in the grocery store. And they say, we don't know how to handle this freedom because it wasn't based on biblical morality. So our country was. Let's go back to 1776, our document of independence. How was that impacted by a biblical understanding of morality and
Well, I'm glad you went there, Isaac, because, in reality, the founders, the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, of which were Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and many others. Franklin and Jefferson actually referred to William Penn as the father of the founders, because he laid down these principles that we're going to be walking through in these next week. But I think there's no stronger way to look at the fact that those who brought to us this declaration and built upon the foundation of the Pilgrims and the Puritans and William Penn came to fruition in the birth date of our country on July 4th. Actually, it was July 2nd that it was actually the motion was made to form the country, and then then the document was completed, and it actually became July 4th, and we recognize July 4th. But this is the thing that really makes it remarkable to me, I think. 56 signers, Isaac, 29 of them schooled in the Bible. Average people. They weren't professional anything. There were some attorneys, there were pastors, there was a broad collection of people. One was a shoemaker, actually. So they were common from that perspective, but they were uncommon in that their view of God was unified. And our culture today has sought to eradicate all of this. And if we don't build it back in, and that's what we're doing this for, because we need to reacquaint ourselves to what our founders knew. But here are just a couple things. In the preamble of the Declaration, do they not appeal to the Creator God and of nature and nature's God? The God who creates is the one who gives life. They knew. And that gives us life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness or private property. All of those things, I said, there is God. God created. God established the value of life and these certain basic things, happiness and private property. And they also laid down in that section about the role of government, that governments are instituted among men, that they should protect these truths. They hold these truths to be self-evident. Truths, integrity, independence, freedom, anchored in God. They knew it. They went there. And then they delineated their grievances to the king. so that the whole world, they said, so the whole world would know that what they were doing was not a spur-of-the-moment thing, but it was a matter of saying God has laid down how man should be and think and act and how government should work, and it's not happening. And to make it clear where they were, and they knew that except the Lord build the house, as you stated, that they labored in vain that built it, they appealed to the great judge of the universe in the last segment of the declaration. And they said to hear the rectitude or the rightness or the purity of their intentions. And Isaac, that brings it right back. And from that day, then we now move to where we are. But our danger today in America is that we have forgotten who God is, we have forgotten our foundations, and the building is falling. And that's the reason for spending time on these as we walk through. But integrity is where it starts, the individual, and then it manifests itself into others, and then ultimately an entire nation. So with that, we'll come back and we'll close and wrap up this part one here in just a moment.
Stand in the Gap is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV, positively different television.
Welcome back to Stand in the Gap. And today, as we've been looking at this idea of integrity, personal integrity, the integrity of our national leaders, our church leaders, it's extremely important. It is a foundational part of having God's blessing. And we talked about, the psalmist talked about, the foundations. And when we look at these, Sam, you brought us through historically some of the foundations of our founding fathers. We keep using this foundation kind of idea, and we see buildings collapse if the foundations aren't correct. And Jesus talks about the foundation on the sand, the guy that builds on that, versus a solid rock foundation. And so you've been talking about William Penn, the father of the founding fathers, which I really like that statement. But in Pennsylvania, which is where we are, where you've worked in civil government as well as self-government and church government and family, all these things. But in this Commonwealth here, I remember going before the Senate to lead them in prayer one time, and I looked at the coat of arms before I went, and it was very inspiring because the coat of arms actually has listed right there, it's right on the flag, virtue, liberty, and independence. So can you maybe tie this together into what we're talking about for our foundations of our nation?
Isaac, I can, and I think it's a great point that you went to there, because this is how it ties together. Virtue is something that came out of the mouth of William Penn. But people, if they search around, they will find virtue written and engraved on many Capitol buildings. It's in Washington, it's on our coat of arms, and it's on other state coats of arms as well. Here's the definition of virtue. It says, nothing but voluntary obedience to the truth. Virtue is nothing but voluntary obedience to the truth. And that's how it ties into integrity. And ladies and gentlemen, just to kind of wrap up this program right now, integrity is the first principle that our founders laid down as essential for a government. If a government that was going to be able to be free, a self-governing republic was the goal of our founders. If it was going to happen, they said it had to start with people of integrity, then move to a government of integrity, led by people of integrity. All of that is relationship to God, who is truth, and then executed in their actions and attitudes to other people around us in the laws ultimately, which would be based on truth. That's virtue. But ultimately, a free republic, a nation given to liberty, and out of that freedom and independence, built on virtue. It's voluntary. Nobody can make you do anything. Voluntary obedience to truth. That is virtue. That's why it's first on our coat of arms in Pennsylvania and many places. And I'd like you to think about that as we get ready for our next week's program, where we focus on foundation principle 2 and 3 of integrity. That is going to be this: no nation rises without God's aid. That was first. Number 2, needs a common unifying vision. We'll talk about that. And then thirdly, obedience to God's authority, and that ties in to virtue. These essential. Thanks for watching us today, and please back with us next week for part 2 as we continue in this series.